Um, this morning we have someone most of you know already, Steve McMullen. He is a member of our church. His wife Laura is a deacon and he has 3 children. He teaches economics at Hope College. He has for almost 10 years, probably next September. He teaches macro and microeconomics, and he especially likes to engage the students into thinking about economics as a Christian, which is certainly very valuable. And Robin is shaking her head because she does the same thing when she taught economics. The topic today is also related to that. It's quite interesting. Have to look at it. It's Christians thinking about poverty, inequality, and the welfare state. This is the first of 2 sessions, but there will be a break in between. So at Easter time, we will not have a Sunday school class. So very exciting. I should also say, and I hope we can get him for a Sunday school class next year, is he's interested also in animal ethics. You know, think about that, what that might mean. So I hope you would be willing to do that, you know, what it entails, everything. So, Steve, you're on.
All right, how about, oh, wow. So now I can really hear. All right, so let's, I'm not going to say all that again, but just for those of you who didn't hear it, or those of you online, just assume I said something brilliant. And so we get to the New Testament and this theme of caring for the poor, but also this concern within the Christian tradition for the common dignity of everyone. It's just baked into who we are, right? So Christians have always been concerned for these reasons about poverty, but we disagree a ton about what that means, particularly in sort of in every context you go through. If you study sort of Christian history, but certainly in the 20th century, we spend a lot of time within the church disagreeing about what our concern about poverty ought to mean for our own behavior, but also, of course, for public institutions. All right. So poverty and inequality are political, partisan, economic issues. And they're things that the church cares deeply about, but also disagrees about. So what I want to do in these 2 weeks that I've been given is to split up the set of questions that I want to talk about. And then this week, all I want to try to do is describe what is going on, certainly what has been going on over the last 30 to 50 years with poverty rates and different kinds of inequality in the US and around the world. And I'm going to show you lots of graphs. And that's partly because I love graphs. It's also, though, it's a way for me to hold myself accountable to show you data from reputable organizations and not just tell you what I think or try to spin some story, because there's a lot of that happens. And every time that I go dig into the data myself, I have to change the way I talk about what's going on, because I find that I actually thought about something a little bit wrong, right? And so I'll try to show you lots and lots of numbers, but we're just going to try to tell a story about what's going on. And then we'll try to talk a little bit about the stories economists tell about why what is going on is going on. All right. So today's going to be mostly descriptive. We'll be thinking about what's going on and why it might be. And then when we come back after Easter, we'll attack a different set of questions, primarily around how we should think about economic justice. And there I'll try to present a couple of different sort of faithful Christian perspectives about economic justice and how that might lead Christians to disagree with each other faithfully about these big questions, but also give you a sense of some evidence about the effectiveness of certain welfare state programs. I'll try to bring some evidence of that to bear so we can think about the role of individual charity and the role of the church, and then also public institutions. That's my overview. We good? So here's my outline for today. We'll talk about poverty first, we'll talk about inequality, and then we'll go global. We'll start in the US and then we'll look around the world a little bit. The broad story I want to tell you is that a lot of people tell simple stories about poverty and inequality that are too simple. So if you think things are getting worse, you're right. And if you think things are getting better, you're also right, but in different ways. All right. Generally speaking, I say things are probably getting more better than they are getting worse. And I'll try to give you that story first. So first, let's think about how we want to talk about poverty. There's a couple of different things here. I'm going to show you some data that's a little bit different than the poverty line you might be used to thinking about. So I'm going to give you some quick vocabulary here before I show you the first graphs. The official poverty measure that we use, if you talk about someone's household being below the poverty line, or if there's a program that someone's eligible for if they're below the poverty line, this is a reference to an official government measure, the official poverty measure, and it's determined by 3 times the cost of a basic diet of food for a household of a particular size in 1963, and then it's just been adjusted for inflation since then. All right, and so this is what we'd call an absolute measure of poverty, which absolute in the sense that it's a way of measuring a particular standard of living. And if you're below that standard of living, we think there's some trouble. And if you're above it, we think you might be doing a bit better. But we just try to draw a line, kind of an arbitrary line, but it's a line so that we can measure how many people are in that zone below. There's another measure of poverty that we've been working on for some time now through the Census Bureau that gives us a little bit more data in some ways. I'll show you. This is a supplemental poverty measure, and it includes a broader set of types of income for people. So rather than just looking at how much they're earning from their job, we can also track how much they're earning from government sources, different kinds of benefits. But it also does a better job of tracking expenses. So the poverty line is different for people who live in different states with different costs of living. Or some places, of course, housing is very expensive. Some places it's cheaper. So this supplemental measure of poverty will include a bunch of different expenses and adjust that bar a little bit based on where we're living. So this is the supplemental poverty measure is usually calculated as a relative poverty measure, meaning poverty measure that just measures where you are relative to other people in society as opposed to relative to a stable benchmark. What I'm going to show you, though, is a version of this that is also an absolute measure. All right, so first graph. Here's the story I want to tell. Turns out poverty is getting better. We don't see this, though, if we look at the normal data. So let's pick these lines apart. The first one, look at the blue dotted line. This is the official poverty measure. And this shows us the percentage of people in the United States that are below the poverty line, starting in 1968 and go. All right, that blue line, the blue dotted line is going up and down a bit over time. When the economy starts to slow down, the number of people in poverty goes up. Of course, when the economy is doing really well and it's easy to get a job, then that measure goes down. But it starts around 15%. And in 2012, it ends around 15%, right? Not much progress. Now, if you know over that time period, if you're paying attention to politics, you know that between 1968 and 2012, we did a lot to try to fight poverty. And so a lot of people look at that stable number of people in poverty over that time period as a kind of a failure. Like, we did a bunch of stuff and we're getting nowhere. All right, this is why I think it's useful to look at some of the new data. If we look at the red line, this is the anchored supplemental poverty line, and this counts for more types of income, but also different expenses, remember. This one shows some real progress. According to this, if we go back to 1968, the number of people in poverty were more like 25%. And by the time we get to 2012, it's down to about 16%. Now, what's the difference here? Some of it is we're measuring in this line the additional benefits that people will get from food stamps or from government support for housing or other kinds of benefits. So this shows a little bit better the impact of those kinds of support, but also it accounts for housing prices and clothing prices and utility prices a little bit better as well. Now, that decline, oh, you know what? That didn't work. There we go. That decline didn't change much for people sort of 18 to 64, people of working age. The decline was much smaller. We're going from about 20% to only 15. Let me jump back again, as opposed to 25 to 16. I could show you a better graph, I suppose. I don't think I have it here, of folks above 65. And what you'd see is a really steep decline. So it turns out a lot of the benefits that we've seen in terms of poverty decline since the 1960s is that folks over 65 are much less likely to be in poverty today than they were back in the 1960s, right? Huge change there. And partly that's because more effective public institutions, and also it's partly because the population of adults sort of in sort of the end of this area are better prepared for old age than folks were in the 1960s and 1950s in terms financially. All right, but this is the piece that I think makes this particular study that I'm pulling these from really interesting. So what they did is they asked, okay, we've seen poverty decline. That's good news. Let's ask why. Let's ask, is this because people's incomes are going up? Or is it their earned income? Is it easier for them to find jobs? Are they earning more? Or is it because government's giving them more support? And so what they did is they calculated this poverty line using the same data, but they pulled out any income coming from the government. And so that gives us the blue line along the top. This is the anchored supplemental poverty measure, pre-tax and pre-transfer. So before the government taxes people and before it gives some money back. And we'll talk about some of those programs, but not right now. And what you actually see is there hasn't been any progress over time once we pull out government programs. So the poverty rate in the 1968 is basically the same as the poverty rate in 2012. I have some newer numbers as well, but this study looked at this time period. Once we take out the benefits that people got from AFDC, from food stamps, from SSI, and other sort of cash benefits. And earned income tax credit is a big part of this as well. So what can we tell about poverty then? It's a mixed story. Is it getting better in the United States? Yes, definitely. What we can see from these numbers is that there's fewer people below the poverty line once we account for the value of government benefits. And if we don't account for the value of government benefits, the number of people in poverty is about the same as it was 30, 40, let's see, geez, 50 years ago now. Right. Okay. Let me push this a little bit further. This graph takes a look at the whole population of the US and asks, how much did income grow for people who were or for the poorest segments of society all the way to the richest segments of society between 1967 and 2015? Both of these, then the differences between pre and post tax and pre and post tax and transfers. So the way you can look at these lines is the black line, or the black dots, sort of that have that sort of straight upward sloping line, tell you how much incomes have increased between 67 and 2015 for each segment of society. So this first dot, this 5, is up around 28. percent. And that means that for folks who are in the sort of the poorest bottom 20th of the income distribution are 28% richer in 2015 than those comparable folks would have been in 1967. All right. And we flip that, let's go right to the middle, the 50th percentile. The black dot puts us right around 80, which means that the person right in the middle, same number of people poorer, same number of people richer than them in 1967 is, well, I'm sorry, in 2015, they're 80% richer than that middle person would have been in 1967. And then all the way over on the end, on 95, we're up around 145 or so. That means the richest 5% or so of folks in the US are 145% richer than their comparable folks would have been back in 1967. Yeah. This is actually tax and transfers. So the black line is before the government does anything. All right. So then the gray line asks, all right, so let me move, before I move to the gray line, let me just note two things about this. First off, know that means that between 1967 and 2015, everybody is better off, right? Everyone in the country is richer over that 50 years than they were before, which makes sense. The economy has grown a lot. We've had a lot of advances. Education is mostly improved. And we've seen a lot of progress, and so we would expect everyone to be a little bit better off. We'll talk more about that later. But you can also see, of course, that the growth in incomes are faster at the top than at the bottom, right? And we'll talk about inequality in a little bit, but this sort of gives you a sense of where that growing inequality is coming from. Everyone is getting richer, and the folks in the top half are getting richer faster. Now, I want to caution you, of course, that the folks in 1967 who are up here might not be still the same people that are up here in 2015. Right? You could have a lot of money in 1967, and you could lose your job and be back down in the 30th percentile in 1968. Right? So people could move around. We're just sort of taking a look at the whole economy at once and slicing it up into pieces. I should pause. Other questions? We can do questions all the way through. Yeah. Because if we wait till the end, you might be like, well, I think there were 3 confusing graphs, and I can't remember which 3 it was. Yeah.
Are you going to talk about generational wealth that makes a difference?
Let me think. We are going to look at wealth. Yeah, in about 4 graphs or so. But I don't have the data in this presentation on like the percentage of wealth people get from inheritances and these kinds of things and gifts, which is really interesting. But I don't think I included that here, but we could.
And the other question that I would ask now is, what about the effect of technology? After the period that you've been graphing, there weren't many expenses. Now there are a lot, and expectations.
Sorry, give me that question again.
Technology. So much now depends on having a cell phone or having a computer and having access both for work and for other living needs.
Okay. No, all right, this is a good point. So we are going to talk about technology later, but not necessarily in that sense. But you're right. In some sense, when once cell phones become normal, then all of a sudden you can't afford to not have one, because every job and school and public activity that you need to go to, right, is going to assume that you have access to the internet, right, to find out where it is and get the information and get access and all of this. And all of a sudden the cost of living has gone up. Yeah, that's totally a thing. We will talk about that a little bit. Yeah, before we're done. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't do really well in math. I just need to say that, preface my.
I'm going to show you some pretty complicated graphs too.
Yeah.
It's going to be great.
So Is it possible, am I reading this correctly? This is income percentile, but it's not percentiles of the population. So could it be that 75% of the population could be below 25% of the income? And
Oh, I see.
you see what I'm saying?
That's a fair question. And in this case, it is 5% of the population. So this is telling you what's going on in the poorest 5%. This is the next poorest 5%, and so on and so forth. So this is breaking the population up evenly. Yeah. But yeah, that's all right. So the big picture here is that there's been real growth in income and growing inequality. And the government programs, taxes, and welfare state programs have been moderating that. And you can see that in the gray line. So the gray line shows you what this income growth looks like for different segments of the income distribution once we take into account taxes and benefits from the government. And the thing that's really interesting here is that you see, particularly for those folks that are going to be around the poverty line, which is going to be in about this bottom 15% or so, 20, depending on how you measure it. For those folks, their income growth is really significantly higher because of the tax code and benefits, right? And particularly for programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, that's going to hit people kind of in this whole zone here. And it has a significant impact on people's annual income. We can talk about the details of the Earned Income Tax Credit if you want at some point, but it basically is a tax subsidy that hits folks between about 5 and 40th percentile. But what it also means is that income growth, when you look at the numbers this way, has actually, after we take into account taxes and transfers, has been pretty similar across a lot of the population, right? Except for the very top, right? We'll talk about that, which means we actually have 2 inequality stories, right? Or actually 3 inequality stories happening here. We're gonna have to talk about each of them separately. But the first is that if you've heard a story like the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, half of that is true. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting richer, and they're getting richer for different reasons. And the rich are getting richer faster, and the poor are getting richer because our public benefits are a lot better and better delivered and better designed and more generous than they were in the 1960s. Right? And that's sort of primarily what we see. But also, if you compare the average person to someone who's just below the poverty line, those incomes have grown pretty similarly once we take into account taxes and transfers. So there's not growing inequality between the bottom and the middle. There's growing inequality between the bottom and the middle together and the folks in the top 20, top 10, and particularly the top 1%. All right. Let me think do I have any more poverty pictures here? Oh, yeah, no, now words. Okay. So I think it's worth taking a step back here and just noting that different people will come to a discussion about poverty with different criteria in mind. And there's some debate about whether or not the numbers I've just shown you are a success. So if you think that the role of the state is to try to provide benefits for people so that they no longer need support, so that they become more self-sufficient and they don't need those benefits. If you think of public benefits primarily as a very short-term sort of unemployment insurance, get back on your feet kind of program, then something is going wrong here in the sense that these benefits are the main thing that's driving income growth for folks in the bottom, and the labor market isn't doing it. Right, so job opportunities are not the thing that's causing income growth for folks in the bottom 20%. It's public benefits. And public benefits are becoming more generous, and people are better off as a result. But they're not primarily better off because the economy is growing and opportunities are improving. Both those things are true, but it's really not hitting the bottom 20%. Right? It's hitting sort of the top half primarily. But if you're asking, are government programs successfully improving people's lives in material ways? Undoubtedly so. Undoubtedly. There's a real significant benefits that we can see from a lot of government programs, and I'll give you some specific evidence on that in 2 weeks, if I don't scare you off this week. And when we start to evaluate some programs, particularly food stamps and health insurance programs like Medicaid, they have really big positive effects. So that's I want to pause there. That's how this is the data on poverty, and I think it's a mixed success. Yeah.
Steve, do we know whether it's basically the same people who stay in poverty? So when you talk about, are we helping people become self-sufficient? If there's a kind of a churn in who's getting benefits, then maybe it's working. If there's not a churn, then maybe it's not working from
So
that point of view.
No, that's a great question. And this is one of those things where we have some data on it and it's not amazing. So I can give you really good data on the distribution of income as a slice at one point in time. But tracking people over lifetimes and over generations, our data isn't as good because that's harder. Getting people to answer surveys every year for 20 years. That said, there is a lot of movement. So most people can think over the trajectory of their lives and think about how much money they were earning. And a whole lot of people will say, yeah, when I graduated from high school, when I graduated from college, when I was in grad school, I was around or below the poverty line. And then I think, okay, well, when I'm in my 40s, I was definitely above the poverty line, but I didn't really have much wealth. And then you think, okay, when I'm in my 60s, I had higher income and I had built up some wealth. And so if we just take a snapshot in time, there's going to be movement, right? If we in multiple snapshots, some people are poor at one point in their lives, but much better off later on. Certainly, that's true for my family. And yet, there is significant persistence. Particularly for folks in the very bottom who are having a hard time getting attached to the labor force. Certainly people with any kind of disability, right? It's very, very difficult to build wealth and income. And you do find an intergenerational component to that as well. So depending on where you're born, has a big impact on your sort of long-term job opportunities. And there's some really good studies coming out now about just county by county all over the country. Some places seem to be places where kids could be born into a relatively poor family and have a pretty good career. And other places, it looks like a trap. So that's a complicated answer, but yeah. All right. So here's a follow-up question. So when I present this, hey, poverty is getting way better story, one of the questions I often get is, sure doesn't seem like that. Like, wait a second. If people around the poverty line are, I don't know, what did I say, 60% richer or something than they were 50 years ago, right? Why doesn't it feel that way? And this is one of the debates that happens, I think, particularly between conservatives and liberals about thinking about economic issues, is how do we characterize the problem of poverty over the last 50 years? I'm going to argue that there's 4 problems that are making this progress on poverty seem less significant. So we're going to talk about prices of goods. We're going to talk about the amount of time people have to work to earn the income that they're getting. Turns out that's going up. We're going to talk about social mobility, and then we're going to talk about inequality. Right? I think all of these contribute to the sense that poverty is getting worse, even if in raw dollar numbers it's not. So first, let's think about the prices of goods. Oh, wrong one. Sorry, preamble. First off, note, on average, big progress. I wanted to show you just change in median household income over time. If you go back to, I wanted to go back to the 60s, but the Federal Reserve only had data back to 85. So this shows movement from 85 to 2023 in median household income. And just to show you there's been real progress, another snapshot, this is that median income. We went from having an income of around, sort of the average household, around $57,000 a year. In 2023, even after this decline, we're at, about $74,000 a year. So that means this is a little shorter than my lifetime, but over that lifetime, the middle household in the US is noticeably better off in monetary terms. And yet, sorry. Yeah, Robin? Oh.
So you'll probably present this, but in terms of numbers of people in the household, that Will you bring up that issue?
No, I won't. Oh, but that's interesting. So, I mean, households are getting smaller.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we did a per
And,
person,
and
yeah.
yet in the lower income, they're still quite large relative to that.
Well, so yes and no. I mean, like birth rates are low kind of across the board right now.
Okay, I take
Uh,
it back.
Yeah. And like 2 earner households are more likely to be in the top half. I'll show you a little bit about that. Okay. All right. So the first problem is that some things are really expensive and some things are cheap. So I wrote this book where I'm debating redistribution with a kind of libertarian philosopher, and we go back and forth. And one of the things we have to hash out is like, is poverty even still a problem? And one of the points of evidence that he came up with that said, you know, poverty in the U.S. is not much of a problem, is that if you just look at what people are able to afford today, even the poorest people in the US have refrigerators and air conditioning and flat screen TVs, which is totally true. And then, you know, and then I'll turn around and say, yes, but they can't afford medicine or school, right? Or a house to put their flat screen TV in, right? And so the problem is that we have two things going on at once with prices, and a graph like this kind of illustrates this. Some things have gotten way cheaper over the last 50 years, once we adjust for inflation, and some things have gotten way more expensive. And the things that have gotten a lot cheaper are these things kind of down on the bottom here. Oh, just so you know, to read this graph, we're going all the way back to 1950 here. But we're starting out at 100. And so if the home appliances are down around 10 or 15 by the end. And that means that once we adjust for inflation, home appliances are a small fraction of the cost that you'd pay for washing machines and dishwashers in 1950. Those appliances were just way more expensive. And then if you go up to new vehicles, it looks like a new car, after adjusting for inflation, is about half the price that a new car was in 1950, right? These things are getting way cheaper. And they're also getting better, right? Cars, they live longer than they used to. I'm not sure about appliances. I think appliances might be less good, but you'll just note, so the things on the bottom half of this graph have gotten super affordable. And so if we track progress in terms of manufactured goods, then it will look like we're doing awesome. But then if we turn around and try to measure progress in terms of, can we pay to have that car repaired, or can we pay to go to the doctor, or can we pay for an apartment? That one's not on this list, but it's up there. Or can we pay for college education? Then it looks really bleak. And so depending on what you think the essential expenses are, people are either doing a lot better, you know, shoes and TVs, or a lot worse, schools and doctors. And there's a whole story we could get into about why some things are at the top and some things are in the bottom. But I don't have time for that. So anyway, I pulled this graph from a really interesting book on this. Oh no, this is a different graph. Well, anyway, I have a really interesting book on that. But that's one piece. Second problem I said was poverty feels like it's maybe we're not making much progress because there's a sense in which people are working more to earn that additional income. Remember, I was showing you numbers about household earnings or household income. If you have to work 20% more to earn 20% more, it doesn't feel like progress, right? And that's sort of what's happening. So on balance across the population, people are less likely to work than they were in the 1960s. But if you look at people who are working, they're working more hours. So this graph is broken up between married couples, single parents, dual earner and single earner married couples. And it's going back to 1976, 2018. And what you see is, this is just the total number of hours people in the household are working for pay. So if you go back to the late 1970s, early 1980s, a married couple on average was working, what does that look like? About 2,700 hours a year. And on average, a married couple, whether dual earner or single earner, is working in 2018 closer to 3,500 hours a year. So we have seen median household income, but we've seen median household income go up in part because people are working more, right, to earn that money. If you go to dual earner married couples, that's that top line, right? That is going up. So even when we have two earners, collectively, they're working more than they were back in the 1970s and 1980s. If you go down to single parents or single earner married couples, the increase is a little smaller, but single earner households, you still see the hours going up a little bit. And single parents, it's going up a fair bit. Now, one of the things that's going on is that, of course, there's more people in the dual earner married couples and in the single parent households than there were in the 1970s and 1980s. So anyway, there's fewer of these single earner married couples, that dotted line here in the bottom. So our population is moving between these sections. But if you wanted to compare two households that look kind of the same in 1976 and in 2018, what you'd see is the 2008 household, if they had two earners, a mother and a father and a couple of kids and a dog, in 2018, they'd be working a lot more and they'd have a lot cooler toys, right? And they'd have a bigger house, right? Houses are bigger, the electronics are cooler, and there's a lot more time in the office or in the job. Oh, how long are we supposed to go? All right, so I told myself I needed 10 to 15 minutes for questions, so I'm gonna have to skip some graphs. I'm sorry. I actually have like 10 backup graphs just in case, but you know, maybe next time around. All right, so this is social mobility. A lot of people ask, you know, about, you know, comparisons between parents and children, and we have to kind of go back in time a little bit in order to do parent-child comparisons. But if we do, what we do see is one of the reasons why people feel like there isn't as much progress is because there's a generational difference in how much better off children are compared to their parents, right? Which is kind of a visceral measure of progress, right? If you can do better than if you have a lifestyle that's better than the one you grew up with, you feel like things are going well. And if you have a lifestyle that's noticeably worse or about the same as what you grew up with 20, 30 years before, then it doesn't feel like as much economic progress is happening. And what we see is in the post-war period up till about 1960, so let's look at this bottom line. This is just the difference in raw dollars, adjusted for inflation, between children and parents. So this is how much children are earning more than their parents at kind of the same time in life, right? And if you go back to 1950, kids earned about $30,000 more than their parents had at that time of life. Big differences. Get into the 60s, it's still about $10,000 more. By the time we get to even the 70s and 80s, we're hovering around zero, and that hasn't changed much. So we've gone quite a while in which, after adjusting for inflation, parent-child comparisons are pretty similar. Now, this feels like it contradicts some of the graphs I've shown you before, and it's because the way these folks are crunching the numbers is a little different than the way the folks are crunching the numbers in the other graphs, and has more to do with wages rather than total income. But suffice it to say, there's been a noticeable decline in social mobility, moving up compared to one's parents over time. Yeah.
So I said, wouldn't that have a lot to do with the depression that you're comparing?
Yeah, I mean, the GI Bill hits here, and it's a huge boost in social mobility for a whole generation of people in terms of housing and in terms of education. And that also, though, it sets a kind of a norm and a kind of optimism in American culture about things getting better that doesn't last into the 1970s, and people start feeling like the economy isn't working for us anymore because they're not getting that same boost. To a certain degree. And by the time we get out to the 1980s and beyond, and so I show you this just to note that different generations have had a different experience of that, right, in terms of the rate of economic progress and the rate of wage growth. There's more there, but we're going to talk about inequality. And I told you I'd do global poverty and inequality as well. So, all right, so here's the depressing picture. So this is inequality. This is like the most depressing graph that I think is responsibly constructed. And this is the ratio of the top 0.1% of earners in the country to the average person in the bottom 90%. So it's just the ratio. So If you take someone from the top 10th of 1% and you look at their income, the average person in that elite group, and you compare them to the average person in the bottom 90%, how much richer is that person in the top? And the answer is, over time, well, way richer. Today, we're at about 200 times as rich. But if you go back to the 1980s, it was only about 75 to 100 times as rich, or so. If you go back to the 1950s and 60s, it was about, they were 50 times as rich. But then if we go back a little further, roaring 20s, it was an exciting time to be alive, apparently. We were up at that 200 number for a short period, right? And so when people get really worried about inequality, this is sort of what they're worried about. They're worried not about changes over the general population as much as they are in that top 1% or top 10th of 1%, the degree to which wealth is really exploding for those at the very, very elite levels of income is really, really extraordinary. Now, that hasn't changed much over the last 15 years, actually. Those numbers have stayed pretty constant. I mean, this is, for fairly obvious reasons, this number, or these kind of numbers, are very sensitive to changes in the stock market and other kinds of things. And we've had some weird things going on. But certainly between 1970s and 1990s, there was a really big change here.
Steve?
Yeah.
So there's, people look at two different things. One is income, but one is wealth or net.
This is still income.
Yeah. So
Wealth is, I mean, yes.
is the
bigger.
story different for wealth? My belief is that it's
more
maybe even
extreme.
worse.
I think
Yeah.
I got a wealth picture here. Just a second.
Just a question.
Oh yeah, I'm doing net worth next. Yeah, good segue.
Okay, but
Yeah, I didn't even pay him for that. Okay, so now let's look at sort of another snapshot of inequality, is to look at net worth for different segments of society. So I constructed this one. I have to tell you what the colors are because this text is small. The blue line, which starts around 35% and ends up around 30%, that's the share of total wealth held by the 50th to 90th percentiles. So the person in the middle up to the person sort of around the top 10%. The amount of the total wealth in the country that they have is declining a little bit. Oh, incidentally, I could show you the bottom 50%, but it's just there's just not much there. The bottom 50% of the country doesn't have much wealth at all. So that would hover around 5% of total wealth in the country. Then the red line, sorry, no, let me go to the purple line next. The top line, the purple line going up over the top, that's the share of net worth held by people in the 90th to 99th percentile. So it's looking at the bulk of the top 10%. It goes down a little bit, it increases a little bit, and it stays up around 40% before dropping here recently. And then the red line at the bottom that's sort of growing throughout this time period is the growth in the share of total wealth in the country that's held by the top 1%. So that's also increasing pretty substantially from about 22% to about 30% over this period. Now, this is just from 1990. If we went back further, it would grow more. And we'd see these kinds of trends. But this is another piece that people worry about, is the concentration of wealth. And wealth is always more concentrated because there are so many households that have 0 to negative wealth, right? I don't want to crunch the numbers right now. But if you took our home loan and then you subtracted that from our retirement savings, it's not going to be a big number. That's all I'm going to say, right? So it isn't unusual for folks, even if they have a reasonable income, not to have a lot of wealth, particularly if they're young. Okay. So inequality is growing, although it hasn't been growing dramatically over the last 10 to 15 years. It did grow, like I said, pretty dramatically between, people point to 1976 or 1979, and then about 1995 is a period of time in which inequality increased really, really dramatically in the US. And I'll show you some numbers. That's true in some other countries as well. I don't know if I'll show you those numbers. We'll see. But I want to just note there's like 2 big sets of stories we tell about why inequality is increasing. One is broadly a story about productivity, and one is broadly a story about power. Okay, so let me first tell you the productivity story. This story says inequality is increasing in the US because the folks that are at the top have been have been able to reap the rewards of really significant economic changes. So technology has rewarded some a lot, and it's actually punished other people a little bit. So if you're in a profession where new technologies have made you way better at your job, then your company, your vocation is going to be a whole lot more productive. You're going to earn a lot more. I think most finance, but also if you're in engineering, certainly any kind of broad technology kind of feels that way. You're in that boat. Certainly, like anything related to data science or medicine probably is gaining a lot from technology. The better MRI machine makes the doctor better at their job, right? Education also, it turns out education over time, higher education is becoming more and more valuable. So what's happening is that the reward you get from going to college is bigger today than it was 50 years ago. And the reward, the difference between having a high school and not having a high school education, that's actually not very big anymore, but it's a bit bigger as well. But particularly the reward from having a technical master's degree is much bigger than it was 50 years ago. And so we're seeing a kind of divide also happening a bit in terms of the return to education. And it's part because education is preparing people to do really complicated, cool things. The last thing I'd say, global markets. So it turns out as long as if we're trading all over the world as opposed to just selling locally, and there's been kind of a trend toward more global trade, that also means that if your company is successful, it could be successful on a global scale instead of successful on a local scale. And that has a big difference for how much money you're going to make, right? If you're selling to, billions of customers instead of hundreds of thousands of customers, the really successful people are just wildly more successful than they used to be, right? So the scale of global markets also makes a big difference. So that's one story. The other story is one about power. And this is one where the productivity story says basically people are getting really, really rich for basically good reasons. And the power story says that people are getting really rich for basically bad reasons, all right? So we could also note that there's increasing monopolization in the economy in a couple of dimensions. It's not huge, but we see increased market share for the big companies over time. And that concentration within industries gives companies more power to make more money and charge higher prices and pay their workers less and these kinds of things. Right? We see unions' power shrinking. And anytime union power shrinks, that means the bargaining power between owners of firms and workers is a little bit more stacked toward owners. And the result is that the gap in pay increases. There's lots of reasons for shrinking unions. Some of it's political. A lot of it's just changes in industries. But that's been a big difference between the 1950s and 1960s and the 1990s and 2000s. And then things like taxes and the minimum wage. If we go back to the 1950s and 1960s, or particularly the 40s and 50s, the top marginal tax rate was really high. And so there was almost no incentive for a corporation to pay their CEO $1 million a year. Because if they did, a huge chunk of that would just go to the government anyway. And that kind of effectively put a cap on executive compensation. Starting with Kennedy, but then of course again with Reagan, and then again with Bush, these top income marginal tax rates dropped pretty significantly. Now they're in the 30s. And so now it actually does pay off for a firm, pay off in the sense that the CEOs actually get the money. If a firm offers their CEO $100 million a year or something of the sort, they're actually going to keep a big chunk of that money. And so for that, and then for a whole bunch of other reasons, those changes in tax policy have resulted in or have sort of stopped getting in the way of sort of executive compensation really increasing. And then of course the minimum wage isn't nearly as valuable as it was when it first put in place. Well, first put in place, certainly over the last 50 years, the minimum wage has become less and less valuable. And so we have growth at the top and sort of a little bit decline in terms of our limits on the bottom. So obviously folks on the left, among professional economists that are really good at their work, are going to emphasize the stories over here about power. I kind of mixed up the right and the left here, didn't I? And folks on the right who are responsible and really good at their jobs and know the data are going to sort of emphasize these stories over here. And if you want to tell a story about inequality being something pernicious, you might tell one of those stories. If you want to tell the story about inequality being something about heroic entrepreneurs, then you tell something over here. And I mean, I'll tell you, I think all of it's going on. It's all true. And then the big question that I don't have time to evaluate here, nor do I have the data to evaluate, is like, which of these stories are really the biggest? Okay, questions about any of that? Yeah.
I was wondering about that education. It might be the kind of college education you get. The STEM, I would think, would be economically helpful. The humanities might not be so helpful. I'm wondering about that. Is there any data on that?
I mean, yes and no. So certainly computer science and engineering, they pay off really significantly. And there are big differences between sort of the lifetime wages of someone who gets a computer science bachelor's degree versus someone who gets a business bachelor's degree versus someone who gets a social work bachelor's degree. And it's in that order, right? Because we don't pay social workers very much. And there's a lot of business majors, but there's only a few computer science majors, and they do really valuable stuff. And so you see big differences. That said, even folks getting humanities degrees, which aren't directly connected to a particular technical profession, you still do see noticeable increase in wages. Those degrees from a decent institution are still paying off in a monetary sense, but then the wage growth depends a lot on what you do with those jobs. So the history major could go into finance, right? Or they could become a librarian, and one of those will pay a little more than the other, right? But you're right, there's a big difference there. And I'd like to say, of course, going to a good institution matters and that everyone should go to Hope College, which of course I'm shamelessly advertising. But we already knew that was true, so. All right, so let me do the short version. For global poverty and inequality, the story is just very good, generally speaking. So we see, if we can zoom way out here, these really nice pictures come from Our World in Data, a really cool website that allows you to play with a lot of things. But let me just show you the kind of progress in income per capita around the world that we've seen, sort of zooming out to 1800. This shows you that the bulk of the world population in the year 1800 was living well below what we would consider now sort of dire poverty, right? So we're looking at the bulk of the human population between 50 cents and $1 a day in consumption value once we adjust, right? Once we get to 1975, we see two worlds. So there's a huge amount of the world that's below absolute poverty, which we're now putting at about $2. This sort of absolute sort of subsistence level of poverty is around $2 a day. A lot of the world is still living below that poverty line. A lot of that population is in Asia. That's the red color. Blue is Africa. Green, I think, is South and Central America. Wait, let me check. No, North and South America is green, and yellow is Europe. So you can see what happens is population in Europe gets pretty rich, and then segments of the population in North America and in China are living just a very different life than the larger population that's living below the poverty line. But then notice what happens between 1975 and 2015.
Steve,
I mean, it's wild.
is it important to say that the poverty level being defined here is wildly lower than the poverty level that we were talking about at the beginning of the
Oh,
lecture?
yeah, way, way lower.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is like, do you have enough food to avoid malnutrition level of poverty, which is very different than the poverty line that we set in the US. So the poverty line in the US, I don't want to do math with 20 people staring at me, but it's bigger. But by 2015, we see this just dramatic global change as a huge chunk of the population moves from below poverty to above the poverty line. And if you actually just measure global inequality, it's gone down, right? And this is one of the hardest things to convince people is true if they don't look at the numbers, right? Because we have all these stories about the world is always getting worse and inequality is getting worse, and we only see the bad stuff in the news. But over the last 50 years, the most important news item that you've never seen is hundreds of millions of people being brought out of poverty, particularly in China. In South Korea, the growth is dramatic, of course, in Indonesia and India. The change is just really, really dramatic. And so now we see a world that looks more like this. And that's just because the poorer parts of the world are growing wildly faster than the rich parts of the world. And they're catching up, in a sense, in terms of standard of living. Now, still, the US is sort of operating in this zone out here, right? But globally, the story looks really good. Here is just some numbers about the percentage of the world population living below $2.15 a day, and then I have $6.85 a day. And I'd just like to note that a huge chunk of this decline in global poverty has happened in my lifetime, and particularly since 1990. We've just seen real significant progress. So even if you went around the world and picked out the poorest countries, the countries where you think things have got to be the direst, those countries, their economies are growing faster than the US economy on average. So the story is really quite good. Okay, let's skip that. And we'll just go to this. I mean, I think there's some big questions about justice here. Oh, no, wrong one. I think we have to ask questions about, we can measure poverty and we can track it, but we could do that till the cows come home, and we still have to ask the question, what level of poverty is a real moral problem? What kind of poverty counts as an injustice? And what level of poverty is like unfortunate but not terrible? And we'll probably disagree about that. We have to ask, like, we're living in a world in which inequality is increasing and poverty is going down. If those two are connected, is it a trade we're willing to make? Right? Are we okay with the rich getting really rich if it also gets us lower poverty rates? Because in some cases, it looks like those two things might be connected. If they're not connected, then of course we'd want equality and low poverty rates. And then there's big questions about whether or not we should be more concerned about poverty in the US or poverty globally. And there's really important political questions there, of course. And I think there's good arguments for going both ways. But I put this slide up here just to raise the questions, not because I have any intention of answering them today, but just to note that the numbers I've shown you don't end the conversation, right? They just kind of begin the conversation about what this implies for Christian obligations in the economy. And that's kind of where we'll try to go a little bit more. What is it, 2 weeks from today? Okay, questions?
Healthcare, catastrophic health emergency is often a cause of a middle-class family entering into the poverty class.
Yeah.
And universal health care, very controversial in America, not in Australia and Europe.
So if you, so right now our healthcare system is set up so that if you are around the poverty line, you can be eligible for Medicaid. If you're over 65, you're eligible for Medicare, and then for the folks who don't fall into those two categories, hopefully you have a job with benefits. That's gotten better. So the number of people without some kind of health insurance, particularly the number of people without some catastrophic health insurance, is a lot lower today than it was 20 years ago, right? And that's because the biggest change there was the Medicaid expansion that was a part of the Affordable Care Act. And it hasn't gone through in every state, but in most states in the country now, not the Medicaid expansion, a lot more people fall under that. But yeah, we've decided to create a patchwork health insurance system in the US, and health care costs are really high. I could tell you personal stories with numbers, but Laura says I'm not supposed to share those numbers from Jonathan's childhood. But suffice it to say, I think she'll let me say this. She's listening online, but she can't argue. I tell people that I will never be able to pay back the US federal government for the amount they paid for Jonathan in the first year of his life. I'll never earn enough. I mean, that's a illustration of the level of the cost when you have a really significant health problem. And in our case, it was covered by Medicaid, like entirely. So that's a great blessing. But yeah, it's kind of patchwork. So the folks that are most likely to fall through the gaps today would be adults without children who are earning about $40,000 a year, for whom a really significant medical expense could take a huge chunk of their income, and they probably don't have a lot of savings at that income level. Right? That's
When I was reminding people before I retired about how much improvement there had been in third world incomes and living standards, it was also a time when democracy was expanding
Hmm.
and market access expanding.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of Latin America, which was one part of that great success, but it's going the opposite direction in both cases. Would you like to add something to that turn away from the things that we're moving in the right direction?
You know, some other countries like China's been one of these countries where growth has just been just wildly fast, so that every generation lifestyles have just radically transformed for a couple of generations now, and that's slowing down. I think if one thing I'll just zoom out and just say, if history has taught us anything, it's that progress is not inevitable. You know, things can get better and things can get worse. Now, on balance, we've seen a lot of things get better in the last 200 or 300 years, but not everywhere. And if you look at what happens in countries, in places where there's major political crises or civil wars, or the government just sort of falls apart for other kinds of reasons, the economic story there is really dire, right? Really dire. And Russia went through a lost decade easily in the transition. I mean, like, communism was terrible, and the transition out of communism, materially speaking, was even worse in Russia for a long time. Those kind of transitions are terrible. So I think we can be really thankful for the progress we've seen in the last 20 years in particular, and not assume that it will continue.
I'm afraid I have to stop you.
You
Steve.
do. That's your
There are
job.
Many more questions. But you're coming back in 2 weeks.
In 2
we'll be here.
weeks.
So save
Yeah.
them up if you have any questions, and present them.
I can hang around for a couple minutes too.
Okay, good. Thanks.